Hello, this is Malachi Bishop, and this is RC-750 Rehabilitation Counseling Research and Program Evaluation. And this is the section where we are continuing to talk about data collection and survey research. And in this section, we will be talking about designing and developing survey questionnaires, thinking about the issue of how you can best ask the question and format the response options in order to meet the objectives of the question that you are trying to answer. We're going to talk specifically about what makes a good question. I'm going to say in general, however, a good question is reliable and valid and has the characteristics of being understandable, consistent, and a question that the respondent will answer. More specifically, we will be talking about some principles of questionnaire development. The first principle is to make sure that your questionnaire items match your research objectives, and we talked about that in the last section, making sure that your research question is the focus of the questions on your questionnaire, and that you don't have excess questions that you really don't need. Principle 2, understand your research participants. Remember that your participants and not you will be filling out the questionnaire. Sometimes questions that make perfect sense to you don't make so much sense to your participants. Consider the demographic and cultural characteristics of your potential participants so that you can make it understandable to them. Principle 3, use natural and familiar language. Remember that we are members of a profession that has all sorts of jargon and acronyms in rehabilitation counseling. But the participants and the members of the programs and agencies, if we're talking about program evaluation, they may not be as familiar with our language, our jargon, and our acronyms. So use natural and familiar language. Principle 4, write items that are clear, precise, and relatively short. If your participants don't understand the question, your data will be invalid. Your research study will have the garbage in, garbage out syndrome. Bad questions lead to bad data. Short items are more easily understood and less stressful than long items. So try and keep your questions as short, clear, precise as you can. Define your terms. Avoid double entendre, innuendo, or ambiguity. Respondents don't always see things the way you do, or talk about things the way you do. So again, focus on the language. Make sure that you are clear. Make sure you are using a language that is familiar and sensible to your participants. Principle 5, do not use leading or loaded questions. Leading questions are questions that lead the participant to answer a question a certain way, generally where the researcher wants him or her to be in terms of answering the question. So for example, do you agree with most people that if you use that as a question lead, then you are suggesting that most people feel this way, and so you want to be like most people, and you're probably going to answer that way too. So that would be an example of a leading question. Loaded questions include loaded words, words that have or create emotional reactions or responses. Always remember that you do not want the participant's response to be the result of how you worded the question. You want the participant's response to be the participant's response. You want to use neutral wording and not influence the responses with the form of your questions. Principle 6, avoid double-barreled questions. And a double-barreled questions combines two or more issues in a single question. Are you satisfied with the services you received and the counselor you worked with? That would be an example of a double-barreled question. If you receive a response, say an affirmative response, yes, to that question, you won't really know which question is being answered. You won't know if they're telling you about the satisfaction with services or satisfaction with the counselor. So that becomes a fairly useless question. So avoid double-barreled questions. Principle 7, avoid double negatives. If the answer requires combining two negatives, then it's confusing and it may provide invalid and unreliable data. For example, I disagree that clients should not be required to participate during plan development. That would be an example of a question or a response requiring double negatives. It's confusing. You should rewrite a question like that. Principle 8, determine whether an open-ended or a closed-ended question is needed or most appropriate. Depending on the information that you want to receive and the form of the information and the depth of the information that you want to receive, open-ended questions provide qualitative data in the participant's own words. For example, how can your supervisor improve the morale of your counselors? The response to that is going to be open-ended verbal response in the participant's own words. Closed-ended questions, as you know, require just a yes or no response. Are there ways your supervisor can improve the morale of counselors? Yes or no. So the issue is, think about what kind of information you want to receive, and then make sure that you're asking questions that will get that kind of information. Principle 9, use mutually exclusive and exhaustive response categories for closed-ended questions. Mutually exclusive categories do not overlap. You're either male or female, you're either 10 to 20 years of age, 21 to 30, 31 to 40, and so on. So what you would want to avoid there, and what sometimes happens if you're not paying attention, is you would ask for age 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, and you can see in that case those categories would overlap. If you were in the 10 to 20 and also the 20 to 30, if you were 20, you would actually could be in both categories. So mutually exclusive categories do not overlap. Exhaustive categories include all possible responses and don't leave anybody out. So for example, if you're doing a survey of adult citizens, then these categories would not be exhaustive because they only go from 20 to 69. And if somebody is 70 or older, or 18 or 19, then they don't fit in. There's nowhere for them. So that's not an exhaustive set of potential responses. Consider the different types of response categories that are available for closed-ended questionnaire items. And you have a variety of different potential response options. In a questionnaire, for example, rating scales, which are the most commonly used, include numerical rating scales where the endpoints are anchored and the center point may or may not be. But this is an example here, and you can see in this case the 1 would represent very low and the 7 would represent very high. So the 1 and 7 are associated with a verbal statement, and that's why we say that they are anchored. That would be one response option. Rating scales. There are also rating scales that are fully anchored, which means every potential response is associated with a verbal descriptor. Like number 1 would mean strongly agree, 2 would mean agree, 3 would mean neutral, and so on. So that would be an example of a fully anchored rating scale. But in addition to rating scales, there are other potential responses. You can use rankings, where participants put their responses into rank order, such as most important, second most important, and so on. Or checklists, where you would ask participants to check all of the responses in a list that apply to them. So a variety of options in response formats, and some questions lend themselves to a certain sort of response format and others to another. So the important thing is, again, think about the kind of information you want, look at your responses, and make sure that you are matching the appropriate information with the appropriate response format. Think about social desirability in your questions. Are there any questions that people would be uncomfortable or unwilling to answer? And if there are, remember we talked about social desirability. I said, for example, if you ask employers, are you willing to hire a person with a disability as an employee? That's a question that would perhaps make an employer uncomfortable. But if you really want to know the true answer, then there are some things that you can do. Make sure that the respondent knows that the responses are anonymous, so you can let them know your responses will not be at any time associated with your name. And if you can make the responses anonymous, then people will be more likely to answer those sorts of questions accurately. If there are protections that are offered, so for example, just stating maybe your name is on the survey questionnaire, but in any reporting that we do, your responses will never be associated with your name. So if there are protections like that available, then that may help. Emphasize the importance of accuracy in responding, so that people know it's important that we have the true and accurate answer. And then also explaining the reason that you're asking these questions may make people more willing to provide the accurate and honest response. Some other tips include when you're developing a survey questionnaire, remember to consider control variables. Remember to gather information that you will need that will allow you to rule out confounding relationships. Think also about language and comprehension. Remember that you are not the person completing the questionnaire. Think about the people who you are going to be asking to complete the questionnaire, and make sure that the language is appropriate. Make sure that the questionnaire questions are written at a level that they will be readable and comprehensible to your participants. Getting another person to look at your questionnaire is always a good idea, and they may be able to identify problems with some of the issues we talked about with poorly worded questions or language issues, or they may also be able to identify errors or mistakes that you made in writing the questionnaire that you, after having spent so much time looking at it, no longer are able to see. So show it to someone else, and then whenever possible, pilot test your survey, your questionnaire. Try it out on a small sample before you send it to the large sample and use it to collect data. Always a good idea to do a pilot test, get it back, see where people maybe had difficulty with understanding your questions, or answered them in a way that you weren't expecting, things like that. Get a sense of whether your survey is really ready for the larger sample that you are planning to use it on. So that will conclude our discussion of questionnaire and survey design and survey research development.